In May 19 Kyoto, Nazi Germany surrendered. For millions of people across Europe, this meant the war was over. But for Holocaust survivors, victory did not mean that those responsible had already been punished. Some leaders of the Nazi regime committed suicide. Others were captured. Still others changed their identities, disappeared, or fled Europe. And that was when a question emerged that had not existed while the war was still being fought. What do you do with a man who yesterday was part of the machinery of mass murder, but today has simply vanished from his uniform, his camp, or his headquarters? The scale of the gap was enormous. The Nazi regime, together with its allies and collaborators, murdered approximately 6 million Jews. By 1945, roughly two-thirds of Europe's pre-war Jewish population had been killed. And between 1945 and 1952, more than 250,000 Jewish displaced persons lived in camps and urban centers across Germany, Austria, and Italy. They could watch the first trials begin, while knowing something else at the same time. The machinery of persecution had not consisted of only 24 men at the very top. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg was a historic breakthrough. Senior political, military, and government leaders of the Third Reich were brought before a court. But this was a trial of the leadership. American tribunals later conducted 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials. 177 people were prosecuted, including doctors, SS officers, industrialists, government officials, and military commanders. Yet even that figure was tiny compared with the number of people who had participated in persecution, deportations, camp administration, mass shootings, and the exploitation of forced labor. That is why the post-war Jewish response to Nazi crimes followed several different paths at once. On one path, people collected testimony and demanded trials. On another, they searched for specific fugitives. And on a third, some decided that courts were not enough, and that vengeance had to be carried out independently. These paths sometimes crossed, but morally they led in very different directions. If stories like this matter to you, leave a like and subscribe. In this history especially, it is important to separate what is documented from what later became legend. One of the men who chose the path of documentation was Simon Wiesenthal. On May 5, 1945, American troops liberated Mauthausen, where he had been imprisoned. After his liberation, Wiesenthal began assisting American authorities investigating war crimes. According to the House of the Wannsee Conference Memorial, he soon compiled a list of 91 SS men whose crimes he was able to testify about and handed it to the US military. In 1947, Wiesenthal opened the Jewish Historical Documentation Center in Austria. His weapons were not pistols, but names, addresses, testimony, former positions, and documentary trails. This too was a hunt. It could last for years, and its success depended on whether prosecutors and governments were willing to use the evidence that had been collected. And this exposed the first major post-war problem. Interest in prosecuting Nazi criminals began to decline relatively quickly. The Cold War had begun. Sentences were reduced. Convicted men were released. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, by the end of the 1950s, almost all those convicted after the war who had not been executed had already been released. Many perpetrators never faced trial at all. For someone like Wiesenthal, this was more than a bureaucratic failure. Every lost trail increased the chance that a particular criminal would die a free man. Hunting Nazis, therefore, became a race against time. And it is precisely here that we can understand why some survivors were tempted by an entirely different answer. Abba Kovner approached the question from a very different direction. During the war, he had been one of the leaders of resistance in the Vilna ghetto and later fought with the partisans. After the destruction of Jewish Vilna, he became one of those for whom Germany's surrender could not automatically settle the account. In post-war Europe, a small group of Holocaust survivors formed around him, known as the Nokmim, Avengers, or Nakam, from the Hebrew word for revenge. Historian Dina Porat, who has studied the organization in detail, estimates that it consisted of roughly 50 young men and women. Their idea was fundamentally different from Wiesenthal's work. They were not searching for individual suspects to bring before a court. The scheme that later became known as Plan A involved poisoning the water supplies of German cities. The goal was framed as vengeance on the scale of the 6 million murdered Jews. In other words, the mass killing of Germans, including people whose individual guilt had never been established. This distinction matters. Nakam should not be turned into a romantic story about heroes who simply track down executioners and punish them. Their first plan was explicitly one of collective revenge. It emerged from the experience of genocide and from the belief that a crime of such magnitude was receiving no proportionate response. But understanding the origin of that motive does not transform the plan itself into judicial justice. This is the moral fracture at the center of the story. Where does the demand to punish the guilty end, and the idea of punishing an entire people begin? Kovner traveled to Mandatory Palestine in search of the means to carry out the plan, but Plan A collapsed before it could be implemented. On his way back to Europe, Kovner was detained by the British authorities. The mass poisoning of German city water supplies never took place. We've reached halfway. If the distinction between justice, revenge, and historical memory matters to you, tell us in the comments where you believe that line should be drawn, and support the video with a like. After Plan A failed, part of the group moved to a narrower target. This time they focused on former SS men being held by the Americans at the Langwasser internment camp near Nuremberg. This became known as Plan B. Members of Nakam infiltrated the bakery that supplied the camp with bread. On April 13, 1946, they coated approximately 3,000 loaves with arsenic. The consequences are known from American documents and later investigations. More than 2,200 German prisoners became ill. However, there are no confirmed deaths resulting from the operation. Later declassified American records showed that the bakery contained enough arsenic, at least theoretically, to cause an enormous number of deaths. Why the actual outcome was so different has never been conclusively established. Even this more limited attack was not a judicial procedure. The prisoners were already under the control of American authorities, while the group itself decided who should become the target of poisoning. That is why Nakam remains one of the most uncomfortable episodes in post-war Jewish history. It reveals not only the fury felt by some survivors, but also the danger of the moment when personal and collective trauma is transformed into a self-declared right to determine punishment. But it is at this point that the story takes a decisive turn. Mass revenge did not become the principal Jewish response to the Holocaust. A different approach proved far more enduring, collecting documents, establishing identities, locating fugitives, and forcing cases into court, even when doing so sometimes required covert operations. The most famous example was Adolf Eichmann. During the Holocaust, Eichmann played a central role in organizing the deportation of Jews to places of mass murder. After the war, he fell into American custody under a false name, but escaped in January 1946. He eventually reached Argentina and lived there under the name Ricardo Clement. That biography alone explains why the post-war hunt could not simply end in 1945. One of the central organizers of the final solution was not sitting in prison awaiting trial. He was living on another continent under a new identity. And transforming information about a fugitive into a real operation required a chain of people, each of whom possessed only part of the picture. Fritz Bauer, the Attorney General of the German state of Hesse and himself of Jewish origin, received information about Eichmann's whereabouts and passed it to the Israelis, fearing that approaching West German institutions through official channels might compromise the search. In Argentina, an important role was played by Lothar Hermann, a survivor of Nazi persecution. His daughter, Sylvia, had contact with Klaus Eichmann, Adolf Eichmann's son, and information gathered by the family helped connect the Eichmann name with the man living under the identity Ricardo Clement. Wiesenthal also continued gathering information about Eichmann. On May 11, 1960, a team of Israeli agents seized Eichmann near his home on Garibaldi Street in a suburb of Buenos Aires. The operation was directed by Mossad chief Issa Harel, with the backing of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. 11 days later, Eichmann was secretly taken out of Argentina and brought to Israel. And here the difference with Nakam becomes especially clear. Eichmann was not killed on the spot. The covert operation ended not in a secret execution, but in a public trial. This does not remove the legal problem created by the kidnapping itself. Argentina accused Israel of violating its sovereignty, and the affair triggered an international diplomatic dispute. But Israel chose a judicial form of response. The trial began in Jerusalem in April 1961. The courtroom heard not only evidence from the bureaucracy of the Nazi regime, but also testimony from Holocaust survivors. In December, Eichmann was found guilty, including of crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity, and sentenced to death. During the night of May 31st to June 1st, 1962, the sentence was carried out. Why did the Eichmann case become such a turning point? Because the hunt had finally brought together three things that had too often remained separate after the war: the memory of the victims, a specific defendant, and a judicial process. The trial received international coverage, while the testimony of numerous survivors forced a vast audience to hear the story of the Holocaust not merely as one chapter within the larger history of the Second World War, but as a distinct crime committed against European Jewry. The hunt did not end with Eichmann. Wiesenthal continued his work. Bieter and Serge Klaasfeld pursued Klaus Barbie, the former head of the Gestapo in Lyon, who had ended up in South America after the war. In 1987, a French court sentenced Barbie to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. In the United States, a special unit was created within the Department of Justice in 1979 to identify participants in Nazi persecution who had obtained American visas or citizenship. Over the following decades, it secured legal action against more than 100 participants in Nazi persecution. But alongside the success stories, there was always a list of those who escaped justice. Josef Mengele fled to South America after the war. Following Eichmann's capture, he moved again, and in 1979 he died in Brazil without ever facing trial. His remains were discovered only in 1985, and their identification was later confirmed through DNA analysis. And now we can answer the central question. Why did another war begin for some Jews after victory? Not because the war against Germany continued in the military sense, and not because there was a single Jewish plan for revenge. No such unified response ever existed. The reason lay in the gap between two dates and between two realities. In May 1945, the Nazi state had been destroyed. But destroying the state did not mean that every person who had participated in its crimes had been identified, found, and punished. Some perpetrators were sitting in the dock. Others were already building new lives under their real names or false identities. Still others received reduced sentences and walked free. It was in this space that the different forms of the post-war hunt emerged. For Kovner and Nakam, this gap produced an idea of revenge that went as far as plans for mass poisoning, and for that reason remains morally controversial even within Jewish historical memory. For Wiesenthal, the same gap became decades of collecting names and evidence. In Eichmann's case, it led to a Mossad operation, but ended in a courtroom, where the accused was required to answer to evidence and where survivors were finally able to speak publicly. For Europe, the war ended with Germany's surrender. For many Holocaust survivors, surrender was the moment when another question could finally be asked. Where are the people who did this? Some search for the answer in archives, others through intelligence operations, some through revenge. And history has shown that these approaches cannot be merged into one romantic legend. Victory had already come. Justice had not. And the post-war hunt for Nazi criminals became an attempt to close the distance between those two facts, sometimes through lawful means, sometimes by crossing legal boundaries, and sometimes by crossing a moral line that cannot be hidden, even behind understandable rage.